In the year 390 BC, the city of Rome stood on the precipice of annihilation. This was not the result of civil strife or a faltering government, but rather the march of a foreign force, the Gauls. These tribes from beyond the Alps, whom the Romans viewed as wild and alien, were about to inflict one of the darkest chapters in the early history of the Roman Republic. To understand the Gallic Sack of Rome, we must first look to the north, to the lands beyond the Apennines, where the Senones, a Gallic tribe, had migrated into the fertile Po Valley. Rome, ever eager to assert itself as a regional power, responded. It sent 3 envoys of the powerful Fabii family, Q. Fabius Ambustus and his sons, to mediate. Yet the mission was hardly neutral. Brennus responded with steel. He rallied his warriors and marched south in a campaign that was less conquest and more retribution. The Gauls advanced with frightening speed, descending through Etruria and scattering any resistance in their path. Rome scrambled to raise a defence, and in their haste the Senate mustered every able-bodied man, citizen and ally alike. The resulting army confronted the Gauls at the river Allia, a small tributary north of Rome. It would become a name of shame. On the 18th of July, a date that Romans would forever remember with dread, the battle commenced. Rome's troops were poorly coordinated and lacked the experience to face the fierce, mobile Gallic warriors. The Roman right wing was especially vulnerable, extended on open ground and quickly enveloped. Panic spread. Discipline collapsed. What followed was not a battle, but a rout. Roman soldiers fled en masse, many throwing down their weapons and diving into the Tiber River. Some drowned, others were cut down, the survivors scattered. Brennus entered Rome without resistance. What followed was a methodical and brutal sack. Homes were looted, temples defiled, and streets ran with blood. The old senators who had refused to flee were butchered where they sat, mistaken by the Gauls as lifeless statues until their tragic awakening. For days the city burned. The Gauls made little effort to occupy. This was punishment, not governance. Yet their hold on Rome was incomplete. The Capitoline Hill, where survivors held out, proved stubborn. The Gauls besieged it but were unprepared for a prolonged fight. The defenders repelled assaults and kept morale with tales of future vengeance. One night, a Gallic detachment attempted a silent assault, scaling the cliffs. They might have succeeded were it not for the sacred geese of Juno, kept in the temple atop the hill. Their cries alerted the defenders, and Marcus Manlius, a former consul, rushed to repel the invaders. He hurled one Gallic warrior off the cliff, and the rest were driven back. For this act, Manlius was later honoured, and the geese, ironically, became national heroes. But survival came at a cost. With food scarce and disease setting in, both sides began to weary. The Gauls, content with destruction and eager to return north with spoils, opened negotiations. Rome, desperate, agreed to pay a ransom, said to be 1,000 pounds of gold. According to legend, during the weighing, the Romans protested the Gauls' use of rigged scales. Brennus, sneering, threw his sword atop the weight and uttered the words, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. The Gallic Sack of 390 BC was not simply a military defeat, it was an existential trauma. Rome had been invaded, humiliated and ransomed. The city's myths of divine favour and invincibility were, well, shattered. And yet, from these ashes, something remarkable happened. Rather than collapse, Rome adapted. Its spirit, tempered by fire, emerged harder and more determined than before. The first immediate consequence was a physical transformation. The city, now scarred and battered, undertook a rapid rebuilding effort. Walls were strengthened, homes reconstructed, and fortifications modernized. The Servian Wall, a new stone circuit, rose as a powerful symbol of Rome's new resolve. Militarily, Rome began rethinking its approach. The defeat at Alea exposed the weaknesses of its citizen army. In response, Rome began to professionalize its military training and invest in new tactics and discipline. But even more significantly, the sack altered Roman psychology. The trauma became a foundational memory, retold, mythologized and immortalized in education and public discourse. The Gauls became the archetypal other, the barbarian at the gates, the eternal enemy. The sack also had political consequences. The need for better civic coordination and faster mobilization fueled reforms. Rome invested in roads, supply depots and, tighter control over its allies. It could never afford to be caught unprepared again. Over time, Roman historians would try to soften the sting of this catastrophe. Later accounts by Livy and others suggested that Camillus, a revered Roman general, returned from exile in the nick of time and drove out the Gauls before the ransom was paid. This version, though likely apocryphal, offered a narrative of redemption, Rome down but never truly defeated. Camillus in this retelling became the second founder of Rome, and his legend served to soothe the national pride. But, archaeological evidence and other historical accounts suggest the truth was actually less glorious. The ransom was likely paid, and the Gauls left on their own accord. The legend of Camillus may have been a political invention, crafted to reinforce Roman virtues of resilience and heroism. Regardless of the truth, the sack left an indelible mark. Rome never forgot the date, July 18th, the day of Alea, marking it as a day of bad luck for centuries. Superstition aside, the trauma really reinforced a core Roman identity. Survival through adversity, unity in crisis, and an unshakable belief that Rome must never again kneel. The long-term legacy of the Gallic sack was not just fear, it was fuel. Rome's expansionist drive can be traced in part to this early humiliation. The republic that would eventually conquer the Mediterranean was forged in the fire of defeat. Every wall built, legion trained and treaty signed in the centuries to follow carried the shadow of Brennus and his warriors. Even in victory, Rome would look over its shoulder, always wary of the northern tribes that once breached its heart. In the end, the Gallic Sack of Rome was more than an invasion. It was a crucible. And though the Gauls came as fire and shadow, their brief rule over Rome left behind not destruction alone, but the iron will of a people who, honestly, just refused